Hello friends, I'm Michael Kingswood and this is Story Time. It is Saturday, which means it's time for me to read stories that I wrote that you're gonna love. Now, last year we were reading stories from my 52 Stories in 2023 project, and over the holidays we kind of got away from that because I was doing other things and we went to Blast from the Past, but today that is done. It is Saturday, it is time for Story Saturday, and we are going back to that previous project. We are on Volume 3 of 52 Stories in 2023, and the story we're reading today is called Little Gray Demons. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hey, Kingswood, what do you mean by that? Well, when I was writing this, and for the last couple of years, there's a whole lot of fracas going on in Congress and other things about UAPs, all that sort of thing, and are these things real? Are they government? Is it aliens? What's going on? And, of course, I've interested in that and been interested in the whole thing for a while, and I've read a long time about the whole abduction thing. So I decided to write a story about it, but with a little bit of a twist. So I wrote it, I'm reading it, I think you're going to like it. Let's get to it. If those trees could talk, what do you think they'd be saying right now? Grant turned his head slightly to look at Heather, lying down next to him on the white and blue striped blanket he had carried out here. She brought the picnic basket and food. He brought the blanket and the wine. Even trade, he thought. And it had worked out well. They met at her place at 1 o'clock, and he transferred his booty into the back of her Jeep. Then they hit the road. It was a 3-hour drive out past the Beltway, through suburbia, and up into the Blue Ridge Mountains. And then a short walk from the state park's entrance to this little meadow, manicured infrequently enough that it almost could have passed as wild and untouched, offering a sweeping view down the western side of the mountains. There they had set up their picnic and enjoyed a slow afternoon of leisure, food, and alone time without friends or neighbors or colleagues or work intrusions. He had insisted, and she agreed that they turn off their cell phones from the moment they got into her Jeep. And didn't that make it all that much better of a day? Their little meadow wasn't all that large, maybe 50 feet across and 70 or so from front to back. A well-worn path leading back to the main section of the park led back to where they had left their Jeep. But aside from that, the trees on either side of the meadow were an unbroken wall of yellow and red, and smidgens of green here and there, as the growth prepared for winter. The air was just on the cool side of warm, still pleasant without a jacket, but not for much longer. Within another couple weeks, the leaves would have fallen completely, and the temperatures dropped. This weekend promised to be the last clear weather weekend before that happened. And lying here now, looking up at the passing clouds, listening to the gentle breeze sway the tree limbs all around, and savoring the last few drops of the Pinot Noir he'd brought up to go with Heather's carefully chosen selection of meats, Grant figured the trip couldn't have gone much better. He rolled onto his right side and grinned at her. Those ones, he pointed across to the right, are whispering to each other in jealousy, wondering how a lug like me could have landed a stunner like you, and what are they doing wrong? But paused, then pointed back to the left. But those are wondering how a saucy minx like you landed a prize like me. They're calling the others retards for not seeing it. She had boosted herself up onto her elbows and was looking at the trees off to the right, the waves of her auburn hair falling loosely to just past her shoulders. When he spoke, she looked back at him and snorted, then grinned fondly at him. "You're such a jackass." Grant winked. "And it's my ass you always liked best." She made like she was going to snort again, but instead just broke down laughing, falling back fully onto the blanket. Grant took that as an invitation, and rolled it over more fully, so he was right up against and almost over top her. He caressed the left side of her face and leaned in for a kiss. She raised her head up to meet him, her laughing eyes matching the smile on her face. But just before their lips met, she pulled back with a gasping inhalation. He moved in to follow her, but her hands were up, pressing against his chest, holding him back. Ardor became confusion that was straining toward annoyance for a second until he noticed the look on her face. Her eyes had grown wide, all humor leaving them, and her mouth had dropped open. From shock? But she wasn't looking at him. She was looking past his left shoulder. He rolled halfway back over and turned his head to follow her gaze, and found his own mouth dropping open in disbelief, even as the bottom fell out of his stomach. "What is that?" she said in a breathless tone that barely carried to his ears, so weak was her speech. He had no idea. where just a moment before there had only been puffy clouds floating on the mid-autumn breeze beneath an afternoon sun that was heading toward his bed chamber past the western horizon. Now there was a thing in the sky. It hovered above the meadow where they lay, oblong between a disk and a hot dog shape, dull gray without detail or marking. A helicopter? But no, there was no sound of rotor blades, no roar of a turbine engine, and it wasn't bobbing or adjusting itself against the wind like a helo or a plane would have. It just hung there, completely motionless. But it wasn't silent. Or rather, there was suddenly a sound that seemed to permeate the entire area, penetrating deep through to the core of Grant's body, a thrumming, almost rhythmic, but slightly offbeat, something between a 3/4 and 7/8, but also not. Grant had played violin since he was a kid. He knew how to count time. He did it automatically now, without having to think on it. But this noise, though only a few seconds had passed since he first became aware of it, every time he thought he could latch onto a time signature, it slipped away, like it was willfully not going to comply with any order or reason that could be applied to it. That, more than its sudden appearance from out of nowhere, or its unnatural lack of motion, made a shiver of fear run up his spine. There was an intelligence there, he knew that from the sound alone, but not morality. Not morality? How can you say that? Asked a quiet voice in his head. But it knew the answer just as he did. Of course it did. It was part of him. No mind that deliberately threw off order like the source of that dysrhythmic thrumming did could be from the good, the beautiful, or the true. They needed to run. Grant knew that for certain, but how he knew that he could not say. It came from the same place as his assessment of the object's rhythm, a deep instinct welling up within himself. He opened his mouth to tell Heather to get up and run back down the path through the trees to their car, and there to drive away as fast as she could. He would follow, but she shouldn't wait for him. Just run, get away. But the words didn't come. He couldn't even move his mouth. It was like his muscles were locked in place all throughout his body. Not even his pinky finger would move. He couldn't talk, couldn't get up, let alone run. He could only watch, fascinated but also horror-struck, as a black rectangle began sliding open in the belly of the strange whatever it was in the sky above them. The opening grew larger, and though it was completely black, Grant could nevertheless see movement from within, like creatures moving around. Beings. It seemed the object was lowering even as the rectangle opened, and Grant knew immediately what and who it was that he would see inside, despite the complete lack of light there. He'd read about them in reports and papers that people had labeled as conspiracy theories, saw them in TV shows and movies that riffed off the same thing. The object was coming down to meet them, and when they were ready, they would come out. Little grays, with their large heads and spindly arms, and black, pupilless eyes above a tiny nub of a nose and an emotionless slit of a mouth. They would come and take them, him and Heather both, onto their ship, or whatever it was, and then flashes of remembered scenes that he had previously passed off as sci-fi tripe, but fun tripe, came to his mind. Images of exam tables, stainless steel implements used to probe their subjects, alien human embryos in incubation tubes, and all above the pitiless, expressionless, implacable faces of the Greys as they set about their business of probing and molesting and impregnating and collecting from their selected subjects. A scream welled up from within his mind, pressed against his diaphragm, so hard that it felt like his chest was going to explode from the pressure. But it would not come, the scream. The craft, or whatever it was still descending, and the entrance was fully open now. He could see, even though he couldn't actually see them, the beings lining up to come and get them. Any second now. He must scream so that Heather at least could flee, escape from it, but she was lying right next to him still. He could feel the warmth of her body against his arm, hip, and leg, where she and he were in contact. He could see from the periphery of his vision. He couldn't even move his eyeballs in their sockets. They were locked entirely on the approaching craft, that she remained lying prone. Her chest heaved, and he could feel the tension within her body almost as much as he could feel his own. He wanted to scream, needed to. That need was within her as well, pressing into him through their points of contact, but with the same impotence as he felt. They were both locked in place, powerless to move, to say a word. And the Greys were now dismounting their craft. It had lowered so that the opening was now above them and a bit past their feet. And first one, then two, then three of the little beings, barely larger than an 8 or 9-year-old child, dropped from the entrance, landing in the grass of the meadow without a sound or even a disturbance in the grass. They were exactly as his mind's eye had painted them, except that they were clothed in dark blue, bordering on black coveralls, whereas he had always pictured them naked because why would creatures that had no sex need clothes? And clearly these did not. The trio paused for a moment after they landed. They never looked at each other, or seemed to focus in on either Heather or Grant, nor did they make any sound, but Grant had the distinct impression they were conferring together, somehow. Then, as one, they advanced, coming toward him. For the flash of an instant, Grant felt relief that he was the target and hoped that somehow Heather would escape this encounter unmolested. But then, as the three left the positions they had landed in, another trio dropped down into the exact place the first had abandoned. Confusion, dread, and growing fear had been battling within him. Now that all turned to abject terror. No, not Heather, too. Somehow he could stand it if they were just going to take him. Or not stand it, but at least bear up for knowing she would be spared. But as the lead gray laid its cold, so cold it seemed to draw the warmth out of him like a freeze box, and bone-dry hand atop Grant's raised left shoulder, then tugged at him so that he rolled to land firmly on his back, and his companions maneuvered to stand at his hips and his ankles, Grant knew for a fact that she would not be spared, just as he knew that her torment would be worse than his. The TV shows and the books came back immediately to mind, of women who had reported being taken and then unexpectedly finding themselves pregnant, and then mere months later another encounter or just a lapse of memory, and then discovering the growing baby gone. Collected, no, stolen by the beings that had forcibly impregnated her in the first place. These beings, these gray creatures that even now were also moving up next to her like they were lining up around Grant. No, he wanted to scream. No, leave her alone. Take me and go, but leave her alone. The scream seemed to press against his chest all the harder now that he had more to add to it, and the feeling that he must explode from the inside from the tension of it redoubled, but the scream still would not come. The gray at his ankles bent and gave his leg a tug, and Grant felt his body, stiff as a board, shifting. It seemed the creature had hardly used any force at all, and Grant was no small guy. It shouldn't have been able to move him so easily. And yet he was moving. He felt the folds of the blanket slipping away beneath him, and the tufts of the grass scraping against his cargo pants as the creatures began to take him. And he felt something else shifting, slightly, in his chest. No, not in his chest, atop his chest, beneath his shirt. What was? Then he remembered. The cross, the silver symbol on a leather strap that he'd always worn ever since that retreat way back in high school. The symbol to remind him of Kairos, God's time. He hadn't thought about it that way in years. It had just been a thing he wore because he always wore it. But now the feel of the cool silver against the skin of his chest sang in his mind, and he clung to that feeling like a drowning man to a life ring. Grant hadn't prayed in years. Didn't really remember how, but... Look at that thing up above you, part of his mind said scornfully. A vehicle from another world, and these are its alien crew. What, do you think saying the Our Father is going to do anything? These are flesh and blood, steel and electronic things in the real world, not some stupid theistic fantasy. Pull yourself together and take it like a man, that part of him said, and he could feel the dripping scorn with each word of mental rebuke. But there was something about the thought. Not just the scorn. He had scorned himself for being an idiot plenty of times. Who didn't? But this felt different, almost like it... The gray at his hip drove its toe into Grant's side between the ribs and the hip bone, and the pain, not huge pain, but pain nevertheless, shot through him. Grant couldn't move his eyes, but somehow he focused in on that particular gray, and for a fraction of a second he thought he saw a flash of emotion cross its face. Just for a second, but Grant thought sure it was annoyance mixed with fear? Fear? What should these things have to be afraid of? Grant still couldn't move even a muscle. Couldn't say a word. Sure, he could think, but another toe to his side, and Grant found his thoughts crystallizing beneath the renewed pain from the kick. He'd almost gone back to thinking about how to pray when that kick came in. If another kick, this one harder. Pain, like a lance, swept through him, and Grant would have shouted out, "Jesus!" from the shock of it. Instead, he just thought the word reflexively and hard. The Greys pulling at him stopped, and it looked like they flinched slightly. Flinched? At what? At... The Grey by his hip drew its foot back again, much farther this time, and Grant instinctively knew this kick would be much harder than either of the first two. Jesus, not again. The kicking Grey stumbled mid-kick and staggered to regain its balance. And realization flooded through Grant, a realization he didn't understand or really fully believe. That name could have been what tripped it up, what they were afraid of, could it? There was nothing else to try, nothing came to mind, so he cried out in his mind hard as he could. Jesus, help me! Save me! The trio around him recoiled, stumbling back from him a half a step, and Grant felt a relaxation in his muscles. He couldn't move his fingers or toes, his arms or legs, but his eyes could move, and another pain struck him as teeth closed on his tongue. And that pain only brought elation. He could move his mouth, so he could talk. The Greys had recovered, and were beginning to lean in on him again. Grant didn't know what he was doing. Wouldn't have done it if he'd had the chance to really think it through, but the little respite he'd gotten from thinking the name and calling on it gave him hope, where before he'd only felt terror and despair, so he clung to it, and he opened his mouth to speak it. In the name of Jesus, get away from me! He hadn't meant it as a command, more as a begging plea. It came out with force he hadn't known he was putting in, and the Greys recoiled again. Recoiled, and showed another flash of something that might have been emotion. Or maybe it wasn't on their faces, he was just interpreting the thing they said, because he could hear them, not with his ears, but in his head. You don't get to call on him you've never acknowledged. Oh, really? Well, he'd do it anyway. He repeated the words, louder, and the trio bounded away from him, until they were back beneath the black opening. Frustration and anger, but beneath that, fear, wafted off the three of them, and Grant could feel a surge of relief, and then triumph. They were going back up into their craft, retreating. He knew it. Another second, and they'd be up and out of here, and then he noticed the other three hadn't stopped their work. They had Heather, and were pulling her toward where their fellows stood, and that frustration, melded with fear that had been wafting off the three that had tried for him, shifted into something like satisfaction, as Grant's Grey team saw that their companions were almost away with their prey, and never mind Grant having eluded them. The female was more valuable for the project anyway. That thought was not his own. It had seeped into Grant's mind from one of them, he couldn't be sure which. Didn't matter, because the truth of it was plain, and chilled Grant's to the bone. But if calling on the name had saved him, couldn't it save her as well? Didn't know why he chose the words he did. They just came to him. He fixed his eyes on the Grey at Heather's hip and shouted, "The Lord rebuke you! Leave her alone in his name!" A feeling of cooling cleanness flowed out of the small of Grant's back as he said the words, and he felt a surge of strength flowing through his limbs. And praise the Lord he could move them, arms and legs both. He forced himself into a sitting position and pointed at the same Grey. "Get away, in the name of Jesus!" They dropped Heather into the grass from the speed of their recoil. They had retreated back to the place where Grant's trio had been a moment ago, but now those three were gone. The Grey, who had been standing at Heather's hip, looked at him expressionlessly, but that lack of expression carried a hatred more implacable and true than any scowl Grant had ever seen. Then the trio vanished up into the craft. And then it was gone, winked out of existence, or at least existence in the here and now, between one moment and the next. For a moment, Grant just sat there, stunned and flummoxed by the entire chain of events. Then he saw that Heather had also regained herself and had sat up. Her face was a mask of terror and distress. Tears were running down her cheeks. Her mascara was running, she was crying so hard. "Grant? Grant!" She practically screamed his name. "I'm here, baby," he said, and forced himself over to her side. She clung to him, hugging and pulling him close with all her might, and for a second it almost felt more powerful than the impending scream explosion within his chest had a few moments before. She was weeping, her face dug into his shoulder, her chest rising and falling in time with her sobs. "What were they?" she managed between sobs. "What?" "I don't know, baby, but we're getting out of here," he said. He stood, pulling her to her feet as he gained his own. She didn't let him go, just clung to him. He thought of picking up their stuff, but right then he didn't give a damn about any of that. He turned and hurried toward the path out of the meadow and through the trees to her jeep a mile or so away. As they passed under the canopy of nearly fallen leaves, he said, "I'll tell you what, though, we are going to church from now on." Heather had gotten some of her bearings back, and she pulled away from him as he said that. She looked at him for a moment, pulling him to a halt as she did. He opened his mouth to tell her to get a move on, and they could talk about church later, but she beat him to it. Damn right we are. Right now. He nodded agreement. Then together they rushed to the Jeep, fast as they could. Okay, so a close call. I don't know what you're thinking. Hey, Kingswood, what was that? These are aliens, right? Why, how'd they get away like that? It was like, well, here's the thing, right? There's a bunch of different ways to look at this, and there's a bunch of speculation about the whole abduction thing over the years. And I've said before, I'm a Christian, come from a Christian perspective, and if you look at what's really going on there, beings that have ships that apparently violate the rules of physics as we know them, a lot of speculation that they're actually transdimensional kind of thing. And obviously, if these abduction things and all this stuff is actually happening, that is malevolent. That is not a good, not a good group of people, things, whatevers. And it's like, well, okay, let's see. Define laws of physics, transdimensional, malevolent. That means they're spiritual creatures, but they're malevolent, which means they're demons. Now, I've read a bunch of stories, a bunch of accounts of people who are experiencing the abduction thing, and as soon as they call out to Jesus, it stops. I don't know how true that is, but I heard that, and I've read those stories before, and I've been skeptical about transstellar beings visiting us because, let's face it, there's a lot that goes into that, and a lot of scientists these days are like, aliens wouldn't really come themselves; they would just use probes and spacecraft and von Neumann probes and things like that. And I guess it'd be so much, less risk to it. And that's probably may be true, but even if that's the case, that leads to the question of, are these things really aliens? They seem spiritual, and they seem to be malevolent demons. Well, then they're demons. So let's write a story about that. So that's what I did. Didn't necessarily intend to take it that route when I started it, but it worked out pretty well, and I liked it, and I hope you did too. So yeah, that's that story. Kind of fun, I think. All right, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, Kingswood, I love that story. How can I buy your books? Great question. Here's the answer. Best way to buy my books is to come over to my site, michaelkingswood.com/store. That would bring you to this place, which is my company's store where you can get books, merchandise, all kinds of great stuff that I've set up. And but you're wondering how it works. Well, here, let's check out Glimmervale Chronicles, which is my heroic fantasy series that I've talked a lot about. If you haven't read it yet, you really should. It's a super fun series. Everything you would want. You should start with Glimmervale, which is the first book. Come over here to Glimmervale. It'll load up. Hey, look at that. You get the book description, links to other books in the series, great stuff. And you can pick the format you want. You got ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook. Not everything I've written is an audiobook yet, but almost everything's a trade paperback and everything's an ebook. But like, hey, I know what you're thinking. Hey, I'm buying from you. How do I get the ebook? There's a service that I work with called Book Funnel. When you buy from my site, they will send you a link. That link will lead you to a page where they will walk you through how to load your ebook onto the device you're choosing, or you can just download it to computer and do whatever you want with it. So that way it's easy peasy. Maximum profit for me. All kinds of fun for you. But I know, a lot of you guys, you like your Kindles, you like your other things, and you want to go straight to the retailer, and that's fine. You can come over here to michaelkingswood.com/books2read, the number 2. And I have this handy dandy universal book-like aggregator page set up. You can scroll through, look at all my stories, all my books, and pick which one you want, and then go from there. Here's how it works. Let's do Glimmer Veil again. So Glimmer Veil, first book in the series, you click on it, you get this thing, you get the book description, you get all other books in the series, and you say, get it now. Okay, get it now. Look what happens. Every retailer where you can find it is here. You can pick the one that you like best and say, okay, cool. Well, let's say I wanted to buy it in, I don't know, let's just say Kobo, because why not? Click on it. And then it'll ask you, is this your favorite store? If so, you set it. So every time you come back, you don't have to choose. It'll just go take you to your favorite store. But let's just, you don't have to do that. Well, we're going on to Kobo. Hoo-yah. Hey, look at this. Here it is on the Kobo site. People like it. People have bought it. Good stuff. Links to other things of mine. And, or you can do one of the other stores that you like. Either way, you get the book you like. I get money. It's all good. All right, so now that you know how to buy books, let's talk about next week. Next week, we are continuing with Volume 3 of 52 Stories in 2023, and that will be a story called Fiery Business. It's been a while. I don't necessarily remember what this one is about. Let's have a look at it real quick. It is... Oh, yeah. It is about a supernatural encounter at an MBA school. It's good times. I liked it. So come back next week for that. Also come on Tuesday. We're doing readings from my Glimmer Veil Chronicles #1, the first book of my heroic fantasy series. You should check that out. We do that on Tuesdays, and also, of course, do other things throughout the week. If you enjoy what we're doing here, make sure you have subscribed and liking it, and tell all your friends. Come back next Saturday for the next story Saturday, and I will see you then. Until then, don't do anything I wouldn't do.